From the hidden secrets of our backyards to the realities of the third world, we take a raw and real look into the challenges and the pursuits of social justice. Welcome to The Point. The Point podcast is brought to you by The Point Foundation, offering healthcare, entrepreneurship, and education in rural Haiti. Visit lapointefoundation.org to find out how you can get involved. When I started international work in 2009, I was drawn to the world of caring for orphans. I mean, after all, isn't that what all good missionaries and humanitarians do? It wasn't until years later, after moving full-time to Haiti, learning the language, and acclimating to the culture, that I would find out that all of these kids who are in orphanages aren't really orphans. In fact, it's estimated that over 80% of those kids actually have parents who are alive, but it's due to financial burden and other complications that these kids are relinquished to orphanages. And this isn't just in Haiti, it's a global crisis. With hundreds of millions of dollars poured into undocumented orphanages every year, combating this crisis can feel overwhelming, to say the least. But that is where partnership comes in. We don't have to do this alone. Today, we talk to one of those very special organizations that's pioneering the way to a more safe and just future for vulnerable kids around the world. Please join me in welcoming Brandon Stiver to the show. Brandon has worked in the child welfare and nonprofit sectors for over 10 years. Before joining 1 Million Home, he led a family-based care and advocacy program in Tanzania for several years. He's also worked in the California foster care system at various churches and teaches on issues facing at-risk kids at the university level. He has a master's degree in global development and justice and is passionate about the indigenous leadership, community mobilization, and seeing global entities come together and deliver the best care for at-risk children. This conversation today will take us all from a place of paralysis and feeling overwhelmed by all of these stats and information into a place of strength and movement. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to meet. So I'm familiar with, I know you work with Child Hope, maybe a few other organizations.
Yeah, we have a couple connections down there, but yeah, Child Hope is our lead partner in that country.
Very cool. So my personal experience seems to have a bit of overlap in yours too. And I would love for the listeners to hear your story, but a lot of what I was doing early on was definitely like, let's go down and hold orphans and bring them Christmas presents and this type of thing. And it wasn't until I moved there and learned the language and like had been there for quite some time that I was like, whoa, this is not what's happening in the world. And then I kind of pivoted more to social business, and we imported and exported artisan goods as a means to alleviate poverty, job creation, orphan prevention, that type of thing. So I was connected to Brian from America's Kids Belong, I believe.
Yeah, Brian Mavis.
Yeah. And so he told me about you all, and I was like, what? This is so cool. The world needs to hear about this, because I think that we want to do well. We're just miseducated. We don't understand exactly, what this all means. And even myself, included, like being there, doing it, traveling. Yeah. So yeah, the majority of our people work in some element of social justice. I think that this like family-based care, I feel like almost like no matter which part of like social justice you work in, there is this element of like caring for kids and like what exactly that looks like, because kids become adult. Establishing success from early on is helpful. So thank you, Brandon, for being here.
No, I'm excited.
Yeah, well, great. I would love to hear. I know you have this like rich history of how you got started in this space. So I just love to hear your personal story and what that looks like and how you got to do what you're doing now.
For me, I grew up in the church, and I was actually attending in the early 2000s or mid 2000s in Costa Mesa. And I actually felt it was like a divine calling to go and run an orphanage in Africa was really what I felt. And I had not been to Africa. I was going to a faith-based university down there and kind of just pursued any opportunities for short-term missions trips or, volunteering in Africa, and got selected to go to work with quote unquote, work with a children's home in Tanzania. And we ended up going there. I started as a child sponsor once I realized, okay, we're going to be with this children's home. I started sponsoring one of the kids, started to draw some of those kind of emotional kind of ties pretty early on. And once I went there in 2008, it was just kind of like, oh yeah, this is totally where I want to be. Went back to California, where I'm from, and just kind of started to tell really everyone, friends, family, whoever, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to go and work at a children's home in Tanzania. I feel like this is what, God is calling me to. This is what I feel like is the course of action for my life. Went back to the same city in 2009. Instead of doing the 2-week trip, I did a 2-month internship this time around, and got to continue to build relationships with people in Moshi, including with that children's home. And it was during that time that the executive director said, hey, do you want to, come on staff? I had finished college at this point, just kind of looked at it and said, wow, like I'm stepping into my destiny, kind of thing. And I ended up moving there only a year and a half after graduating. I still had all my student loan debt. I still, but it was, I just felt like, this is where I'm supposed to be. And so I moved there in January 2010, and really just kind of brought up just a whole range of different events that it was almost kind of like, even though I was in my early 20s, it was almost kind of like a coming of age, because all these different things there's like a confluence of all these different things that happen when you're suddenly in a cross-cultural experience and trying to live out your passion. January 2010, I moved there, ended up spending 2.5 years at the children's home working. And there's a lot with children's homes that there can be a lot of corruption. There can be a lot of issues. The children's home that I worked at was quote unquote good. Like there wasn't any corruption. The leadership was fine, but started to realize even in that type of circumstance, man, these kids need families, My wife and I met during a short-term missions trip for her while I was living there permanently. We got engaged 6 weeks after meeting face to face. So that would be a whole other podcast episode, I suppose. A year later, we got married. So engaged in 2011, married in 2012, engaged in 2010, married in 2011, kid in 2012. And once we became parents, it was really evident like, oh, this is a different type of relationship. Because I had kind of fancied myself as like, I'm a father to these kids. I'm a father to the fatherless. I'm a whatever, But once you have your own kid, you kind of realize, man, these kids are amazing and these kids need moms and dads. But what I'm doing working at a children's home is not that. And then that kind of started off this really kind of learning experience, and also kind of to a certain extent unlearning, right? And walking back some of those emotional ties that I thought I was developing, but really these kids were just needing properly attached parenting. They were needing family. And that's really, the backbone of every society is families. From there, we went back to the States. 2013, I spent over a year living back in the States early in our parenting, but then returned to Tanzania and spent 5 years doing a family-based program. That's really kind of where I cut my teeth on pursuing better practice when it comes to supporting orphans, vulnerable children, at-risk kids, and so forth. So we ended up doing that for 5 years, then went off. Our organization downsized, and we returned to the States. I worked in child welfare in California for about a year before joining 1 Million Home, which is where I work currently. So that's a little bit about my background and kind of what led me to where I am right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've been with 1 Million Home for how long then?
Over a year and a half.
Over a year and a half. Okay. And tell us a bit about what you all do.
Yeah. So at 1 Million Home, we are a global accelerator of small to medium-sized nonprofits that are well-positioned to affect family-based care change. We work in a sector, if you can call it that, around care reform. So essentially, there are models of care for children in any given country, including in the United States. If we have American listeners, there was a time when there were orphanages here in the US, and we still have some types of congregate care, but they're more around group home. If a child has to enter an alternative care setting, the default is going to be going to a foster family and so forth. But there was a time where those kids would just go to orphanages. So what led a situation where the United States was primarily using orphanages to now being in foster family as kind of the default. Well, that was a care reform process, right? And there continues to need to be care reform in the United States. Now, in a lot of countries like Tanzania or many other places, I know you have a background in Haiti. This would be the case there as well. They're further back and they're still over relying on residential models of care. What we need to see is those care models reformed, right? We need to see more emphasis on family-based care and community-based services. So that's kind of the space that we operate in. What we look at is there are organizations in these given countries, whether that's Kenya or Sierra Leone or Haiti or whatever, that actually have exhibited the ability to go from being an orphanage to being some other type of entity that will actually be family focused. And as other organizations within that given region or given country recognize the need to transition to family-based care, what we do is we build the capacity and accelerate those organizations that have already done it to empower other organizations to do the same within their given context. It's a bottom-up approach. It's basically a lot of these policies are already aligning. We had the UN General Assembly in 2019, which was a lot of countries coming around, pretty much every country in the world, basically, saying, yeah, we want to see kids and families. We have a lot of the, alternative care guidelines from the UN, which have been around for over 10 years now. A lot of the big policy stuff is kind of already done, including at the national level. The problem is implementation. So that's why we look at these small to medium-sized nonprofits and say, how can we get behind you guys and build you guys up so that you can affect greater change at the grassroots level? That's what we do. We operate in a community of practice model where organizations, they could be in Ethiopia, they could be in El Salvador, they could be in India, they could be in Thailand, where they have learned some things and they can share those things. And then we enhance their collaboration with one another and then release assets in an open source format. So that might have been a little bit all over the place, but that's kind of what we do. In a nutshell, we accelerate best practice child welfare.
I love that. Let's give some foundation because we have lived in this environment for a long time. But for our listeners who might not be familiar, are orphanages and children's homes considered the same things? So, for example, in Haiti, there's a stat that gets thrown around a lot that 80% of kids living in orphanages have parents that are alive. So walk us through a little bit how kids even get into orphanages, what a poverty orphan is, and all those kind of technical things.
Yeah, absolutely. Orphanages and children's homes are often kind of used interchangeably. Children's home is a little bit euphemistic. It's kind of just dressing it up a little bit. It doesn't sound as bad as saying orphanage. There are differences in residential care models. So an orphanage is a residential model, right? So you have the kids there. There's not parents, but there's staff, There is a spot for residential care, but unfortunately what we see is there's an over reliance on it. And whereas a lot of the policies might say this is supposed to be a last resort, in many countries, including Tanzania, where I was, it was really the first resort for a kid in a bad place.
Is that just because it's like easier? Like, it's just like, let's have a building and let's bring these kids in? Or what do you think like the reason for that is?
It comes down to what services are being offered. Okay. For us, if we have a simplistic view of what the needs are for children, we will default to simple answers. And an orphanage is a simple answer. It's not that it's easier. It takes way more money to run a children's home. It doesn't yield the same results, but it's a simple answer. There's different things that, I could think through. And, I do think that there's a tie to a little bit of ethnocentrism. A lot of these children's homes are funded by Westerners. They may have some distrust of national and indigenous populations. So it's a little colonial in certain aspects. So where they think, we're going to do a better job raising these kids in our funded orphanage than their poor parents could do otherwise. But essentially, every government, including the US, relies on nonprofit service providers. So when I worked in foster care in California, I worked for a nonprofit. I didn't work for the government of San Luis Obispo County, but the government of San Luis Obispo County, the state, Santa Barbara County, they relied on our organization to provide some services that they themselves were not able to do. And then there were government subsidies and so forth for that. So the services were actually family focused, they were community focused and so forth. The same thing happens in the global South. And forgive me, Callie, if I'm getting too technical here, but I do think it's an important question that you asked, where if we're going into a situation and saying the solution that we're going to provide is residential care, and you get one person, two people, three people, a dozen organizations that say this is the service we're going to be providing. And then you look at these countries in the global South where they don't have the infrastructure and they're not going to be able to subsidize or fund anything. They're just going to go with whatever service is being offered to them. So we don't necessarily have organizations that are going in and saying, well, we want to strengthen families, or we want to subsidize education costs for poor families, or we want to do any of these different activities that can actually strengthen the family and actually be a lot more cost effective. We have people going into these high tourism areas, especially, where they say the service that we want to provide is an orphanage. So it's not that it's easier, but it's a simpler kind of mindset. It's misapplying a very simple solution to a very complex situation, if that makes sense.
No, that's so good.
I would just say it's not that it's easier. It's just that it appears to be more simple. But again, the results are not great for kids that have grown up in orphanages.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, and you touched on it briefly, is like the idea that what I was always blown away by was that I wouldn't move to like Austin, Texas and be like, I think that I'm going to take care of these kids and just like open a house, like literally rent a house and then start collecting children. Yeah. Simply put, I mean, you're right. Like with the lack of infrastructure in the developing world, there's not as much accountability. So many orphanages are not registered. The kids many times don't have birth certificates. Sometimes the families understand that the kids are not going back home. Sometimes they think it might be like a boarding house or something like that. Sometimes it's not explained to them that the kids might get adopted and move to America. And so it's interesting to think about the idea, this ethnocentrism, where we might not do the same thing in Austin, Texas, but if we go to Ecuador, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to say like, oh, we should probably open some orphanages here. So it's an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, no, it's a very significant disconnect. And that disconnect plays out not only in starting those types of operations, but also visiting them. So in a similar way, if I was going to Austin, Texas as a tourist, I would say, oh man, I heard they got great barbecue down here. So I'm going to find the best barbecue joint, and I hear they have a great music scene. I've never been to Austin, but this is stuff I hear, right? So these are going to be the things that I'm going to do as a tourist, right? Yeah. I wouldn't go down there and say, oh, I'm going to visit a group hey, I'm going to open up a pamphlet, welcome to Austin, Texas. And then I'm going to be like, okay, cool. How can I visit a group home here? I wouldn't be allowed. Who am I? That would never be allowed. And yet in places like Moshi, Tanzania, or Port-au-Prince, Haiti, that's exactly what we do. We have to kind of rethink, well, why are we allowing this disconnect? Yeah. And why is it that the kids in these countries in some ways deserve less than what we would want for our own kids? Heaven forbid, if something were to happen to me or my wife, my kids would go to their aunt or their grandparents or, somebody. But somehow we allow these kids that even are in really difficult situations to somehow receive something less than what is best for them. And the best thing for every kid is to have a loving mom and dad that can help them, guide them, provide for them, take care of them, attach with them, help them process and regulate. That's what every kid needs. So that should be the standard that we hold across the board, regardless of where the kid is.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. So do you think it's like a matter of just re-educating us as North Americans and maybe like doing some backtracking on what we've been doing for the last 100, 200 years, especially in the like field of missions? Or where do you think is a good place to start, and or where is 1 million homes starting?
Yeah, well, I do think that education is a big piece to it. As we've kind of wrestled through this within our team, I teach at a university. I'll use this as one example. When I taught my undergrad students, so this is, 20-year-olds, about when we did a unit on children outside of parental care, and I just kind of talked with them and I said, this is why we don't just want to start residential cares. This is why it's not appropriate to just go and visit orphanages on short-term missions trips. And as I talk through them with them, they're just like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? Now, these are 20-year-olds. They've spent the last year and a half in COVID lockdowns, so they weren't doing any short-term mission trips when they got to the university. They're totally unencumbered. You just kind of help flip the switch, and then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes more sense. I shouldn't do that. I should find other ways to get involved and volunteer in an ethical way and so forth. Now, if people have been on that trip and they've had that emotional connection with a child, that is a lot harder to walk back because unfortunately we like to think that we can just educate and just reason with people and, help them. They can kind of ascend cognitively to, yeah, I know family is better and so forth, but and then they kind of like, but we're the exception, or, but this kid really is special to me. The kid that I sponsor or the kid that I, visited, they really do need this. And I really am that for them, so you kind of rationalize it. There's an example that I use often from a social scientist, Jonathan Haidt. He talks about a rider and an elephant. And when you see somebody riding an elephant, you think that's like the reason. So we think like, oh, my reason is leading me. I've been educated. I understand what the right thing is. And I'm going to tell this elephant to go wherever it wants. But that elephant is your emotion. And the truth is that elephant is going to go wherever it wants to go. It's an elephant, Essentially, once you arrive there, then you'll just kind of rationalize it and say, oh yeah, no, this is where I wanted to go. The bigger thing with people that have had these emotional experiences is really how can you help them process that and change their mind. And for somebody like me, it took a few years, and some really big experiences, like actually living in Tanzania, being able to compare that to having a child. Like these are really big things that had to move me emotionally to the point where I started to kind of learn like, oh, okay, now I can add the knowledge in. You know what I mean? So it's a challenge because you have to go after both. It's not just purely head knowledge. There also has to be that heart knowledge, which is actually in a lot of ways even more important.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So what are some of the approaches that your organization uses? Is it re-educating? So, because you kind of almost have to have like two different things, right? Like you're actually doing the work on the ground, helping to kind of do some care reform. But then are you also having to convince is the wrong word, but are you also having to like have a mindset shift within the donor community? And how does that work?
We do need to switch within the donor community at large. And there are organizations that focus on that. We do that to a certain extent. With us, we kind of are striking where the kettle is hot. And really where the kettle is hot is like Kenya, and like these other accelerators that we're working with in Sierra Leone and Uganda and Haiti. Essentially, there are organizations that are coming to this realization. And we do, within our community practice and 1 Million Homes specifically, we do work with boards, like nonprofit boards, to help them realize the importance of transitioning to family care. So that's kind of where we focus ours. We do need larger shifts in the community at large. And we have done like media and like, we have a lot of media assets on our website for people to kind of get that education piece and kind of see like, yeah, there is a better way. Here's a story from Sierra Leone. Here's a story from Kenya. Here's, kind of thing. We do that, but we need more of it. The Barna Group, along with Faith to Action, just recently released a study that was just focused on American Christians and how much money they put into residential care annually. And the number is $3.3 billion.
With a B, for those of you that didn't hear.
Yeah. B as in Brandon. Yeah, B. $3.3 billion annually going into residential facilities. So it's a pretty big beast to kind of turn. So we do need that. What has been successful for us? I think we're still figuring that out in a lot of ways. We have been able to partner with some large mass engagement and some people that are well known, including for the faith-based community. You would know Francis Chan. So like he's a partner of ours, and we took him to Kenya and kind of showed him like, hey, this is what this looks like. And so we have done some of that. You find somebody that's trusted and you show them, and then hopefully they can guide others. And I think that that's effective. Again, people will allow themselves to be the exception. So we really actually have to figure out more ways to kind of flip the switch emotionally so that people can start to come around. There are examples of donors, general donors, churches, Christians, non-believers, of course, that have started to realize, actually, you know what, I shouldn't do volunteerism at orphanages. You know what, actually, my money, my donations will be better used somewhere else. We're like at the tip of the iceberg, it feels like, when it comes to that particular piece.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. As we mentioned earlier, share a similar story myself. And like, you're right. It's humbling. It's good that you put that perspective to it, that like, maybe we expect people's mindset to shift because we wrote a good blog, and you're like, wait, these massive, like life-changing moments had to happen for each of us for us to really see the reality of it. And that included living in other countries, learning the language, developing relationships, and putting our own egos aside. So that's a good perspective to keep myself, humble, and listeners too, is like, wait, let's have some grace with people. Like, yes, this is an important topic. Yes, let's keep like doing the work, but also let's recognize sometimes it's not just as easy as a good blog post.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes a lot. And do write the blog post, but that's just one small piece, or even some very compelling video. That can be great, but we need to keep chipping away at it because it's pretty big.
Yeah. So give us an example, because it's such a massive thing that 1 Million Home does. And I'm sure it's a bit different per organization, but maybe we can like use an example. So like, say organization Save the World's Children, exists in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And for the last 40 years, they've been an orphanage. They're sponsored by donors in the United States, and they're starting to say, wait a second, we want to shift this model of care. So they reach out to you. What kind of happens next?
Yeah, well, for them, they're in luck because we actually run an accelerator program in Haiti. For them, there's some initial kind of like assets. So one of the things that we have is online learning. So if our platform Journey Home would be able to give them some of that initial direction, everything we do is free and open source. You don't have to pay for anything. People can go on there and they can actually just learn and just do like a 6-hour course from our partners in Kenya, just walking them through, this is what it looks like to reintegrate a kid. This is what it looks like to do family assessments. This is what it looks like to do social worker visits. This is because that's the main thing, is that people don't even know how.
Exactly. Where do you even start? Yeah,
exactly. So, and people need practical knowledge. Unfortunately, sometimes within our sector, people just kind of get bombarded with these really thick manuals, and it's like, holy smokes, I'm not even going to read that, and oh, by the way, English is my second language, or whatever. It's helpful to have somebody as just another indigenous leader that has walked through it before. And we work with multinational teams, so there are Americans as well, but walking through, we would get them plugged right in with Journey Home as kind of like that passive knowledge that they can get in. But if they find themselves within an accelerator country like Haiti, we could actually get them plugged into an organization that actually has already gone through the transition. They know the policies of Haiti. They know what it looks like to work with boards, what it looks like to work with the government, what it looks like to reintegrate kids safely, which in Haiti right now, that's a challenge because of all the turmoil that's there right now. It's a very difficult context. But nonetheless, we could get them connected with somebody that's going to actually just be able to walk them through the whole process. And those services are provided free for charge because we do that in partnership with them and subsidize everything that happens in the country. So you could actually get somebody to walk you through the entire process. This is how you change your organizational structure. This is how you reunify kids safely. This is how you scope out what you want to do next. There's another term that's used within this sector called deinstitutionalization. Fortunately, sometimes deinstitutionalization has just been taken to mean just shut them all down. We actually, for orphanages that were started in good faith and have decent leadership and decent funding to be able to continue operating, we want them to continue to work. because there is such a lack of services in a given country that it would be great if you could transition your children's home and say, actually, now what we're doing is we're providing low cost preschool for our community, or actually we're right next door to a health clinic. So we're going to use our facility to expand what they're able to do. Those types of things like healthcare services, education, social services, these types of things strengthen families. So what we want to do is we want to see, can you transition to being something else that's going to actually strengthen families and communities? If you're in one of these countries, including Haiti, you could actually get connected with somebody that could walk you through what that looks like. It is a longer process. I could give you some super long manuals if you wanted to read them. I won't bore your listeners with that, but there are processes, and it is important to do this diligently and to do it safely, because we're talking about child protection. We're talking about child welfare. These kids deserve for us to do things, not only to do the right things, but to do them the right way.
Yeah, so good. I love that. We should talk a bit about why it matters again for us, being in, in this sector. We've seen it. It makes sense. We've heard, statistics about unplanned pregnancy, gang involvement, drug use, suicide, etc. But I think maybe for people who this concept is new to, let's talk a bit about why it matters for kids to be raised in a family environment.
Yeah, I mean, that is really kind of the basis of all of this, because if we could just raise a child wherever and they'll turn out okay, then yeah, an orphanage would be totally a viable option. But people are not cogs in a machine. People are people that have emotions and have intelligences. And there is a need for development, especially in regards to children. And unfortunately, when a child passes through adversity, that has a very detrimental effect on who they become as adults and who they are as children. When kids have gone through any type of separation, that right there is traumatic. It's important that we kind of think through, how can we get this kid back to family? Whether you are a religious person or whether you are not, even however you define family, pretty much everybody is going to recognize that this is the most natural place for a kid to grow up. Kids don't just crawl out of the ground and say, I'm a street kid, or I'm an orphan, or kids come from somewhere. And the most natural place for them to be is with their family of origin. And there are instances where kids cannot safely return. So we have to look for alternative family options like adoption or long-term foster care or other forms as well, those being the foremost. But kids need, for healthy development, they need to have attachment with at least one primary caregiver. This is from years and years of research, going all the way back to the mid 20th century, with John Bowlby made his recommendation to the World Health Organization in 1950 something, that orphanages are not a good place for kids to grow up. So, I mean, we're talking 70, 80 years ago, right? So, so kids need attachment. Kids need parents to buffer them emotionally and help them regulate. Kids need somebody to advocate on their behalf when it comes to getting other important services like healthcare and education. And all of those things are best done in a family. And for our listeners, we could have some care leavers that are listening, people that exited care and they feel the full brunt of not growing up in that environment or being separated from that environment for at least a part of their childhood. But most of the listeners are going to recognize, well, I grew up in a family. Why wouldn't I want that for somebody else, right? And families are not perfect. There could be any number of different issues in the family. Nonetheless, it is the best context for a kid to grow up. And if there are issues in that family, it should still remain to be the context for that child to be assisted, if that makes sense. So I guess that would be some of the reasons why it's important. And again, we would want this for our own children, and we should want that for other kids as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So if people are listening and this is striking some heartstrings and they want to get in touch with you, maybe start a conversation, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can reach out to us at hello@1millionhome.com. So that's the number 1millionhome.com. You can also find us online. You'll find a lot of those assets if you were to if you just wanted to learn more or see some of the videos, media assets that we've developed to for you to learn more or for you to communicate with your friends and social circles, you could just find that on our website. Just kind of scroll to the bottom and hit Media Hub, and you'll find a lot of that information if you just want to learn more. There's other ways for people to plug in. For some people, they say, I've been given to this children's home for years, but, I kind of feel like it's run its course, or I talked with them about family care and they're not moving. And, if you want to switch who you're giving to, there's ways to do that. Man, I spoke with one pastor. Her and her church were supporting an orphanage in Haiti, and they realized, oh, this orphanage is trafficking children. So for them, it was like, okay, who can we support instead? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And they actually got connected with an organization from our community practice based in Uganda that's doing fantastic work, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes it can even just be like, you know what? I got $25, I got $50. I want to give that towards something. So there's ways to just give directly to our partners just through our website. We focus on collective impact. We subsidize a lot of activities for our partners, but we're not a foundation. We're just a capacity builder. So we get people connected with technical advice. We build a relationship. We enhance collaboration. We provide direct support for cases that help kids get back into family. We have direct services in Kenya. It's really, we want people to, when the lights come on, we want to have a quick and easy way to connect. So people can just do that through our website. You can hit partner with us. You can check out the Media Hub, and you can learn more.
Perfect. I love it. I'll be sure to include that in the show notes as well. I always like to kind of wrap up the conversation with asking if there's one thing you wanted listeners to take with them, what that would be. But before I do that, is there a particular story or moment that sticks with you from throughout your years of this type of work that helps to keep you motivated on doing what you're doing?
Oh boy. Yeah, there are stories. I certainly think back to my time living in Tanzania for several years and the work that we were able to do there. There's a few stories from that time that are just fun. And with all of these, it's not like, oh, then there was a rainbow that showed up over us and the kid lived happily ever after, because
I wish it was like that.
I wish it was like that. It's not a Disney fairy tale, but there are stories where it's just like, wow, okay, yeah, for that kid, it turned out better. So I'll just share one story from there.
Awesome.
I was running an organization. We had a team there in Moshi, Tanzania. Our organization was called Kingdom Families. We had a relationship with a particular children's home that knew that we provided family-based services. It became known, interestingly, a boy that had left the orphanage came back one day and saw one of the new intakes. And he kind of looked at him. He said, well, what is he doing here? And the orphanage director said, oh, well, no, he just came from the Department of Social Welfare and he's an orphan. This is the story. And then this boy who had left care, but was just coming back for a visit that afternoon, said, that's not his story. I know this kid. He's from the same neighborhood as me. Mm-hmm. So the orphanage director started to look into it and then contacted us and said, hey, we might have a kid that is kind of here under false pretense, which is very, very common. So we started to look into the situation. The kid had been taken to the Department of Social Welfare, and the grandma said his mom is a prostitute, his dad is dead. I'm the dad's mom, but I have cancer. And, it's just kind of this whole story. And we need him to go to an orphanage because, again, even though the policy in Tanzania says it's a last resort, it's actually often a first resort. So this kid went from being with his grandma to the Department of Social Welfare and then into an orphanage all in one day. It doesn't sound like a last resort. It sounds like a first resort. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, as we kind of looked into the program or looked into the case, we started to say, well, okay, if there's a potential that this isn't true, what can we do? We found out, okay, yeah, his mom is still in the area. The dad is not dead. So like parts of the story weren't true. Anyways, long story short, we get the kid back into the community and we're providing family-based services. And the kid, who the kid ends back up with? With the grandma that took him to Department of Social Welfare. Okay. The thing that she said to us after we were working with her. So there was a preschool nearby where it was like $3 a month for the kid to go to preschool, right? That's something that strengthens. We help the kid get a birth certificate and very affordable healthcare. and kind of all these things that kind of strengthen the family. That for us as an American funded organization was like nothing, right? Just so cheap. So we start to work with this family, and at the end of it, the grandma says, well, if I knew that this type of service was available in Moshi, I would not have lied to the Department of Social Welfare. Think about that story. And I'm just like, man, if we could just get more people that just say, hey, we're going to focus on education, or we're going to focus on healthcare. We're going to focus on something else. Like we're going to have more kids that don't go into the orphanage in the first place. And that's really what we want to see. So that would be one story among many throughout partners that are in lots of different countries. But that's just a personal story from what we were doing in Tanzania.
I love that, how it came full circle too.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is one thing you would want listeners to take with them today?
That kids belong in families. If you have kids in your life, find out what they need and find out how you can play a role. If it's a kid that's separated from family temporarily and they need a foster home, maybe look into becoming a foster parent, just to help that kid while they're in a time of transition. If you are a part of a church or a faith community and you guys have outreach or other things or student ministries or what have you, find out ways that you can plug in and just help kids, and help them be stronger in their families. I'm a man of faith, and I read a lot in scripture that talks about orphans and widows, right? So what is that? That's fatherless children and single mothers. Find a single mother in your community who might be having a hard time and buy her groceries. Do something to support children to be in families. Do something to support vulnerable women that are raising these kids. And do that globally as well. Do it locally and do it globally, and make sure that your giving actually matches that as well. So that's what I would love for people to walk away with.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks, Callie. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us today. To get in touch with Brandon and find out more information about what we talked about, you can visit 1millionhome.com. That's one as in the number one, not O-N-E, so 1millionhome.com. And you can also access the free training mentioned in our discussion today at 1millionhome.com/journeyhome/. You can also listen to further conversations at the Think Orphan podcast, and that can be found on all streaming platforms. And you can find them on all social media at 1 Million Home. As always, all relevant links will be found in the show notes at thepointfoundation.org. I hope you learned a lot today. I know I sure did. And until next time, keep on fighting for justice.